Over the years, I've preached many sermons on Christ the King. But despite that, I decided this year to write yet another one. And I wrote in a style that seems to have been appreciated by many people at St. John's. One where I explain the Jewish background to the passage and how that might shed light on the passage for us. Maybe a different light to the one that we had previously seen. I presented different theological viewpoints and asked what all this might mean for us today. And I was just at the point of issuing a challenge for the week, as I often do, when Dave came into the room and said that I should take a break because he'd made lunch for us both, which was lovely. So I stopped. But after lunch, I decided that instead of going back to the sermon, I would get on with some admin and leave the final couple of sentences of my sermon to the following day or even the day after. In the meantime, I came across an Oscar Wilde story, The Happy Prince. And whilst I was unhappy about one particular line that gave a very stereotypical anti-Semitic comments, and I was also unhappy that not all of the aspects of the story fitted well as an analogy for our gospel passage, I felt challenged to ditch my sermon with its very kingly emphasis and use instead a simplified version of Oscar Wilde's story, which I believe others have done before me. Well, here's the story. During his life on earth, the prince had lived a very sheltered life, one full of beauty and pleasure. After his death, the townspeople erected a statue in the town square. It was covered with gold, with 2 sapphires for his eyes and a huge ruby in the hilt of his sword. The story goes that a migrating swallow stopped to rest at the foot of the statue and was surprised to feel what felt like raindrops falling on him when it wasn't raining. So he looked up and discovered that the prince was crying, and he wanted to know the reason for the tears. And the prince said to him, "During my lifetime, I never saw any suffering, but from high up here, I can see so much sadness, and I would like to help, but I can't because I'm fastened to this pedestal. I need a messenger." After a little consideration, the swallow agreed to delay his flight for a day and be the prince's messenger. The prince asked the swallow to take a ruby from the ruby from his sword and take it to a mother whose child was sick and she couldn't afford to get him the help that he needed. The swallow took the ruby and stayed and watched, and he saw the doctor arrive and he saw the sick child recover. The swallow then went back and rested peacefully, sleeping soundly that night at the foot of the prince. Instead of continuing his flight the next day, at the request of the prince, the swallow took a sapphire and gave it to a little match girl who dropped all her matches and feared a beating for the loss of income. These errands of mercy continued, and the eyes of the swallow were open not only to the needs, but also to what he could do to help. He did not migrate, but delivered the other sapphire, and over a period of time, all of the gold from the statue to any who had need. Now the cold that had given him his natural instinct to look after himself by migrating eventually took its toll, and the swallow died right there at the foot of the prince. By now the prince had given away all his riches, but he could not have done it without the swallow. The story goes on to say how the prince's heart broke, and the dead swallow and the broken heart of the prince were cast out by the townspeople as being worthless. Now, unlike the happy prince, Jesus saw the suffering of those around him and gave of himself time and time again during his lifetime. And in his death, he gave even more. This time, not just to individuals, but to all who would choose to benefit from it. The similarity of the story occurs in that from his position on high, Jesus still sees the suffering on earth. But as Mother Teresa put it, he has no hands on earth now but ours. He has no feet on earth now but ours. In other words, he needs a messenger to convey his help, to convey his blessings. And just as the things that the swallow delivered had come from the prince, so any help that we might give to others originally comes not from a prince, but from the King of Kings. Besides this, the riches that he wants us to deliver might be his love, his endless mercy and forgiveness, our forgiveness. He might want us to deliver the promises of his word. And you don't need to be especially wealthy or talented in order to convey these things. You could be as humble and seemingly insignificant as a swallow. And like that swallow, perhaps we need to have our eyes opened not only to the need, but also what we might do to help. We may not be able to solve all the problems of the world, but we must do what we can, where we can, and when we can. After all, Jesus didn't say, whenever you did this for all of these, you did it for me. He said, just as you did for one of the least of these, you did it for me. So I repeat, we must do what we can, when we can, and where we can, and leave the rest to him who is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Amen.